Howdy folks, your Princess ChaoticAyana here. You are all beautiful, and I am so hyped for Resident Evil 8, and I bet most of you are too. Only a couple of weeks till it releases now. But those demo times, like you can play for like a half hour, but only in like an 8-hour window or something. Far too confusing for me, so I decided to go back and play a couple of the older games to get me into the mood. So we're going to do a mini retrospective of sort over the next couple of weeks. I decided to start off with to go back to the black sheep of the Resident Evil family, Resident Evil 6. I sort of found myself wondering when I was looking through the games, hey, did we maybe treat this one a little too harshly back in the day? So I am going to try and answer that question. Join me and let's take a look. So let us set the stage a little here on exactly what I mean when I say the game may have been tread a little harshly. Resident Evil 6 was released in 2012 and received an extremely mixed response from both players and critics. It will be the last mainstream Resident Evil title released up until Resident Evil 7, which took another 5 years and is widely regarded as a reboot of the series. It is in fact not a reboot of the series, but we're going to be discussing that more next week. That and all the other factors though led to Resident Evil 6 being considered a failure. But was it? Capcom were out of their damn minds when they were setting expectations for this thing. Resident Evil 5 sold 5 million copies in its first 6 months, which is pretty damn impressive. Resident Evil 6 was expected to sell 7 million in its first 3. The thing is though, if you ignore the estimate that Capcom largely seemed to have pulled out of, I'll charitably say, the sky, Resident Evil 6 actually did extremely well. It did sell approximately 5 million copies in its first 3 months, so it did better than its predecessor, and even now it's considered Capcom's 4th best-selling title of all time, not just for the Resident Evil series. I also think it's worth noting that prior to the release of Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil as a franchise had moved approximately 40 million units total. Expecting the next title to move another 18% of the franchise's total unit sales was just unrealistic. Now, that rather long-winded explanation that was filled with numbers does have a point. Resident Evil 6 was by no means a commercial failure, so if sales weren't the issue, what was? So let's take a look at the ways in which Resident Evil 6 is perceived to be flawed. Some of these I agree with, some of these I don't, and I'll make it clear which are which. Of all the complaints you hear about Resident Evil 6, the two most common and often most closely linked are that the game is by no means a horror game, and that any scares it might have contained are ruined by it being co-op. That first complaint might seem valid, but here's the thing. As early as March of 2012, 6 months before the release of the game, it came out in October, Capcom was saying the game was not survival horror. As you can see from the quote I'm displaying on screen, their intention to make the series more action-orientated, which had been happening from Resident Evil 4 and 5 onwards anyway, was abundantly clear. And if I'm calling out unrealistic expectations on the part of Capcom, I have to call them out on behalf of the player base too. Resident Evil 6 wasn't being sold to you as survival horror, so why would you expect it to be one? You know what folks, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I want to share this story with you because it's funny. Makes me look like a complete ass as well, which is always good. Resident Evil 4. First played it on the Wii, which I still think is the best version, but we're not going to get into an argument about that right now. Had read some of the press, had seen that Resident Evil 4 was very well received, did not get the memo that we weren't doing survival horror anymore. You know that first village bit where there's all the villagers running around and the bell rings and they all disappear after you kill enough of them? Yeah, had not got the memo about that, ran around for like 2 hours like an asshole, you know, trying not to kill them, trying to save ammo. Eventually I wondered what I was doing wrong and went and googled it and found out I was just supposed to kill everybody. So yeah, that happened. Did anyone else have that experience with Resident Evil 4? Please tell me. Past me will feel so much better if someone else tells me that they did down in the comments. Anyway, moving on. So like I mentioned above, tied to the it's not horror anymore was co-op can't be horror as a sentiment. And okay, it is valid as far as Resident Evil 6 is concerned. Because Resident Evil 6 doesn't do anything with the co-op that would enhance horror, were horror the object of the game, which it isn't. I do want to make it clear at this point though, that co-op doesn't mean you can't be horror, it just limits the kind of horror that you can do. Or well, changes it at the very least. There are so many different things you can do around co-op, giving players different perception of events, letting them have information their partner doesn't, etc, etc, showing them enemies that aren't there, showing them NPCs that one of them can't see. That kind of thing could make an excellent horror game. Hell, Resident Evil 5 was co-op, and I would argue that has some great horror themes and elements going through it. That said, I will admit, Resident Evil 6 seems to have co-op out of some weird obligation to contain it, and it certainly doesn't help the game's atmosphere a lot of the time. There are certainly moments when the second player is just sort of there and waiting for the first to do something to progress forward. Ultimately, I'm not saying the co-op in Resident Evil 6 is good or even well done, because I don't think it is. I just don't think the co-op being there in and of itself was the issue with it. The other truly major critique about Resident Evil 6 is that the game on a whole is unfocused, and I have to agree with that one. If there's one thing that hurts it as far as being a Resident Evil game, it's the fact that the story is kind of all over the place. There is some good stuff here though, let's talk about it. Firstly, because I think it does explain a lot, close to 500 people worked on Resident Evil 6. It's interesting to me because it's simultaneously shocking to hear a number of that size, and it's also blatantly apparent in every single facet of the game. Historically in their development, Resident Evil titles are famous for having iterations of the design process that just kind of get thrown into the void if they aren't good enough. Do you know there's a whole version of Resident Evil 2 you'll never get to play? It's commonly known as Resident Evil 1.5, and it's well worth googling about if you've never heard of it. Hell, when they tried to make Resident Evil 3, the first attempt turned out to be too action-focused and it became Devil May Cry. Resident Evil 6's biggest weakness is that rather than throwing away those ideas while it was being iterated, it just seems to have tried to do all of them. A common thing you hear from people, even if they didn't particularly like Resident Evil 6, was that Leon's campaign is the strongest and closest to that Resident Evil vibe. This is untrue as far as I'm concerned, for a couple of reasons. One, Resident Evil is about a slow build, and Leon's campaign starts off with you shooting the President of the United States in the head. Not a lot of room to go from there. Then it just turns into this kind of repeat of what we've seen before with Leon's character, where Ada Wong shows up, there's some kind of romantic tension going on, and is it just me or is Ada Wong not nearly as popular as Capcom seems to think she is? Anyway, that's all there is to his campaign, there's just not much going on. Of the 4 story campaigns, the one I actually felt was most like Resident Evil, or had the most potential to be like Resident Evil, was Jake and Sherry. Jake is the son of longtime series villain Albert Wesker, and is immune to variants of the progenitor virus. In case you don't know deep lore, progenitor is the virus that all of the viruses in Resident Evil are based off of. Sherry making a reappearance feels quite special because she's the child that we once rescued in Resident Evil 2, all grown up. And they make for a really interesting pair of characters to base a plot around. Ultimately, the concept of characters having a past that they're redeeming themselves for, or redeeming themselves for the sins of their fathers, is very in keeping with the plot of a Resident Evil game. We could even keep that scene where Jake meets his father killer, former series hero Chris Redfield. That's a great moment in Resident Evil 6. That's kind of the frustrating here thing, folks. All of the stuff I've just told you hasn't been anything I've added to Resident Evil 6. It's all already there, it's just buried under everything else. Hell, did you know Capcom didn't even want zombies as they originally featured in the series to be in this game? No, seriously. The quote I'm showing you on screen right now is from Hiroyuki Kobayashi, and what's really sad about this is it shows in the game. The main enemy in the game is clearly intended to be the Yuavo, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. They are around so much more than zombies, especially outside of Leon's campaign, and to be frank, I love fighting them. They have these cool animal transformations when they get injured, they just look great and they're fun to fight. The zombies just all feel so uninspired and so been there, done that, and just that they're there because of loyalty to the brand. Finding out that that was indeed exactly the case made me feel really sad. So ultimately, do I agree with the complaints? Yeah, I agree with some of them, kinda, but I feel that there's a really good sequel to Resident Evil 5 with an interesting story and interesting characters desperately trying to break out of the shell that is Resident Evil 6. So with all that said, looking back, do I feel that maybe we were just a bit harsh? When looking to answer this, I found myself thinking of another game that was released about a year after Resident Evil 6 but has a very similar reputation, Dead Space 3. It had a lot of the same criticisms levelled at it, but during a recent playthrough I had one thought in my head. How much better would this game have been received if it weren't supposed to be a sequel to Dead Space 1 and 2? And I find myself with similar feelings about Resident Evil 6, up to a point. Being the 6th title in the series, and also it's actually not the 6th title in the series, it's like the 8th or the 9th, but who's counting? Anyway, that comes with a lot of expectations that just can't be met. And whilst, as I said, I think there's legs to the idea of using Jake and Sherry to make a logical sequel to Resident Evil 5, I'm aware that would have annoyed a lot of fans, the Leon fans, the Chris Redfield fans, hell, apparently even the Ada Wong fans that Capcom seem to think are out there. Ultimately what I'm getting at is, Capcom were in a position where they were damned if you do, damned if you don't. They got the action fans, the horror fans, they got the Chris Redfield fans, the Leon fans, the Jill fans they didn't get a look in this time around, and Capcom sort of panicked and just tried to do all of it, and it came out as kind of a hot mess. I mean, we didn't even talk about the 21-hour runtime. That said, I just did a second playthrough and I can't honestly say I wasn't entertained. Resident Evil 6 often gets billed as one of the worst games ever, and having just played back through it, I honestly can't agree with that. Yeah, we were a little bit harsh about this one. It could have been much better than it is, but it's still worthwhile. And there we have it, folks. That was Resident Evil for about the next 5 years, up until Capcom released the excellent, soft reboot that was Resident Evil 7. I absolutely love that game, but next week we're going to take a look at why I like the game so much, but why a lot of those things I love make me somewhat concerned about Resident Evil 8. Sound interesting? You'll have to find out next week. Until then, folks, I have been your Princess ChaoticAyana. I just knocked the mic. You are all beautiful. I will see you next week. Peace. I'm out. In just a couple of weeks. But like me, I'm sure you are also kind of struggling a little bit with the demos. They got this weird time-sensitive thing going on. A cat just jumped on the desk. That's not going to be helpful. Good luck, bud.